Today we're going to be talking about energy flow within an ecosystem. And energy flow, when we're talking about it, we're talking about a one-way movement of energy. Okay, we're talking about the flow from how it comes into the ecosystem and then how it exits the ecosystem. And so it moves in one direction. And at every step along that pathway, energy is going to be consumed, energy is going to be lost, passed on to the next. But at no point does that energy ever come back around and get cycled back to the start. So in almost every ecosystem, our original source of energy is going to be the sun. Right? So I say almost every because we do have some ecosystems that are able to exist without the sun, but they aren't very numerous. So we've got our energy source, which is the sun, which is a great energy source, provides plenty of energy, and we don't have to worry about it faltering or is the sun going to be available today? Even when it's cloudy and things like that, plants are still able to receive sunshine through the clouds and things like that. And then we also always have and then we may have a day or 2 days in a row where it's very cloudy and overcast, but there's still enough light there usually for plants to capture it, which is one of the reasons why when we move into the later months of the year, when we move into the winter, fall and winter, plants basically decide that there's not enough light available, right? Our days get very short. It gets dark very early. It stays dark in the mornings. And so plants kind of, do the math on that and realize that it's not worth it to continue to try and fight for that limited amount of sunlight that's available throughout the day, which is why a lot of the trees in the country go dormant. They go dormant in the winter because the light there is not available. And then they just lose all their leaves. And then in the spring, when the days start to get longer, they grow their leaves back and they start all over again. So they just kind of shut down in the winter. And that's really because of that energy source has become less plentiful. So from the sun, the energy source is going to flow to the producers, right? And we know the producers are going to be the ones who can harness that energy, and they're going to pass that energy on to the consumers, and the primary consumers will pass that energy on to the carnivores, okay, and so on and so forth. The next stop would be, essentially passing that energy on to the decomposers. The decomposers getting energy out of it and then doing the thing that they do best, okay? So that's our flow. There's no arrow that loops back. We're not giving any energy back to the sun, right? We're not giving any energy back to the producers. The producers are going to take that energy from the sun. They're going to take all the energy that they need for growth, for repair, for development, for reproduction. They're going to use all of it that they can use. And when a primary consumer eats this producer, it's going to get some of that energy, okay? And if you remember, it's about 10% of the energy that this plant originally got from the sun is what's going to be passed on. And then this organism is going to use that energy for all of its life processes and pass a portion on to the carnivores. And then ultimately, when all things die, they will give some of their energy that's left, not a lot there, but they're going to give some of that energy that's left to the decomposers. So it's a one-way direction. And a lot of times, the way we represent this is what we call a food chain. Right? So I could, I have the sun here, and I could draw grass, and I could tell you that the primary consumer is a rabbit, and then the rabbit is eaten by a fox, right? And then ultimately they all go to the decomposers. So the food chain is just that series of steps showing you where the energy is going towards or where the energy is moving. And if we're going to be a true food chain, we're going to get rid of the sun because sun is not necessarily food, right? So we're just going to be talking about the movement from a producer to a primary consumer to a carnivore. And sometimes you'll include those decomposers there. It's kind of one of those things, everybody knows that the energy ultimately goes to a decomposer, so a lot of times we leave them off of the food chain because it's just, we know that ultimately everything has to go back there, right? And that food chain does a really good job of illustrating our one-way movement, right? So if we start here with a producer and we move to a primary consumer and we move to a carnivore, okay, one way movement, okay, just the flow from in and then out of the ecosystem. And when we say out of the ecosystem, most of that energy, we're talking about it becoming heat, right? So heat is the way that a lot of that energy is lost We can't create energy, we can't destroy energy, it's just changing forms, right? So we're conserving it, and that form that a lot of the energy is going to take is heat, because these these organisms, as they're carrying out the day-to-day function, just like you, when you go about the things that you do, you generate a small amount of heat. If you were to, go to and do an athletic event and you're running around, you're going to start getting hot, which is why you start sweating in response to that. That heat, you're burning up calories, and that's now becoming heat. That's energy that your body is losing. It's losing it to the environment. We don't get it back. It just becomes ambient heat, and when it's gone, it's gone. So a food chain does a really good job of showing the flow of that energy, that shows that it's one way. Another way that we can represent the flow of energy, and it's a little bit more complex than a food chain, is by linking a bunch of food chains together, and that is called a food web. Okay? A food web is going to show all the complex interactions and the feeding relationships between various organisms within an ecosystem. Right? So we take that simple food chain and we apply that to a lot of other organisms. And so that I don't want to just because if I drew a really big food web here, I think we could have arrows going everywhere. So I'm going to keep it pretty simple, but just to kind of show you that movement and where the arrows are going. So we're going to start with some grass in our food web. We're going to have a rabbit in our food web. We're going to have a mouse. We're going to have a hawk. And I think I'm going to limit it right there. That's a pretty limited food web, but you'll see, like I said, the more organisms I add, then the more arrows we get going, and we have stuff kind of going everywhere. So in a food web, the thing you always want to remember is whenever you're drawing arrows in a food web, that arrow is always going to show where the energy is moving. If I want to say that rabbits are eating grass, I am not going to draw an arrow from the rabbit to the grass. I am going to draw an arrow from the grass to the rabbit, illustrating that the energy came from the grass and went to the rabbit. Okay. Mice will also eat grass, so I will draw a arrow from the grass to the mouse. Okay. And then the rabbit is sometimes going to be eaten by the hawk, and so I would draw an arrow there showing that the energy is moving from the rabbit to the hawk. And if we do that, like if this could be a straight line, right? This could be a food chain: grass, rabbit, hawk. But now we introduce another organism. This mouse will also occasionally be eaten by the hawk, and then we draw an arrow there. Okay, so even though it's only 4 organisms, you can see there's quite a bit going on. If you start adding in things, you start adding in other organisms, you start getting arrows going in all kinds of different directions. And a lot of times too, in my classes, I have students drawing these, and I get a lot of really good questions of like, well, can this organism eat that, or would that organism eat that? Organisms like mouse, they're opportunists. They've kind of evolved to whatever's available to them, they're going to eat it. So this mouse could eat grass seeds, but it could also eat a grasshopper or any type of cricket or insect or anything like that. So whatever's around available to them, they're going to make that their food, right? So remember, with each one of these levels, so grass is at the producer level, and then it's giving energy to the next trophic level, right? That food level or feeding level. So that would be the rabbit, and then the next trophic level up would be the hawk, right? Each time we're moving from one stage to the next, or wherever that one arrow ends and goes to another arrow, we're moving through trophic levels. And that's how we classify our consumers. That's how we determine what trophic level they're in, right? So we said that grass was our first trophic level, and the rabbit is eating grass, so the rabbit becomes that second trophic level, right? The mouse, as I said, it would eat grass, so it could be in that first trophic level. But if I were to put an insect on here, right, the insect ate the grass and the mouse ate the insect, the mouse could be both. It could be both a primary consumer and a secondary consumer. Basically what we're looking at there is to see how many different levels are below them, right? So if you've got one level below you, right, this rabbit has one level below it, it's a primary consumer. This hawk has 2 organisms below it, so that makes it in this food web a secondary consumer. And depending on the web, right, how complex the web is, maybe this hawk's a secondary consumer, maybe it's a third level consumer, fourth level consumer. It could be all those things at the same time, depending on what level it decides to feed from, right? If we put a snake on here, that changes things. Like I said, if we add an insect on here, that changes things. So food webs do a really good job of illustrating the relationships that we see within an ecosystem. They are going to identify that food and energy moving around. And notice again, none of this energy is coming back to the grass. There's no arrows that are giving that energy back to the grass, right? Because that energy is being gone. The decomposers are eventually going to give those nutrients back, okay? But the energy is just going to be lost into the atmosphere, into the air, or more likely, be used up by these organisms. Because once they've used it and they've grown with it and they've used it to repair, then it's lost to us. So again, that energy flow, it's always going to move it in one direction, whereas by comparison, matter is going to be constantly recycled.